You are listening to the People Centric Podcast, where we talk through the toughest challenges that people face at work and give practical advice to fixing those challenges. Thanks for joining our movement to create workplaces that are happier, healthier, aligned, and empowered by putting people at the center of all that we do.
Hey, People-Centric leaders, it's Stephanie Anderson back for yet another episode of the People-Centric Podcast. We are excited that you're here with us today for our topic on help. And we are going to talk about how to ask for help today. And now some of you may be great at this and you're good about just saying, here's what I need help with and where I'm overwhelmed and what I am not great at. But I'm guessing for the majority of us, asking for help is hard. And we hear this a lot from leaders that we work with. We even talk about this on our team. Of how we can do better at asking for and receiving help. We're going to break down some delegation myths today, how to set good boundaries, all of that. And so I'm excited to dive into this topic. So quick, I'll introduce who's with me today on the team. So first we have Bethany Taff. Bethany, do you need help?
Oh, so much. I need so much help. Yeah, thanks for asking.
You're welcome. That's it. Thanks.
Okay,
we'll keep moving. Yeah. And then also with us, we have Philip Herzog. Philip, how are you about asking for help?
You know, I am a recovering non-help seeking, but frequent help giver. I think I would propose that we name this podcast episode, What the Help? Because usually, you know, it's when I'm at the point of whatever my word is, I should just be asking for help. That is where I'm at.
There we go.
Funny.
There we go.
Like
That's funny. We probably won't call it that, but I loved that. I'm just kidding.
What? I love it.
Whoa.
I'm like, this is what happens though. And people are like, I need help and I have this idea. And other people are just like, no.
If you don't like my idea, clearly you need help.
I need lots of help, and we're all aware of this.
We all need help.
This is not one of those episodes where it's like, I'm here to tell you this because I've figured it out. I'm going to be a little vulnerable in this podcast because our team knows this about me. I struggle with asking for help. And even when I am really overwhelmed and it would benefit me wonderfully to ask for help, I am not great at that. And so today we're going to get a little peek inside my brain. And I'm just going to be honest with you guys, because I know there are a lot of people out there who struggle with this the same way that I do, and even have been talking to a couple leaders recently that have really struggled with this. And so first, I really want to talk about maybe why is it hard for us to ask for help, even when we know there is too much on my plate. I cannot accomplish all of this, or I'm really overwhelmed and stressed, or I don't know how to do this. Just open it up maybe for all three of us to talk of why is this hard? What are some of the barriers I think that we put in place mentally that stop us from asking for help?
You know, I think from both the professionals we support, tons of different industries, frontline, CEO, all in between. We've interacted with people who can get overwhelmed at every level, and I think who struggle to ask for help at every level. And I think for me, I also personally too, I think that there's almost something more overwhelming about thinking that you can't do it all by yourself. If you're already overwhelmed because your plate is really full, the next level question of is it even possible to do all this? If the answer is no, that leads to more questions, right? Of like, how do I change and what needs to happen else and what in the system is making me feel this way, which feels beyond my control also. And so it's more rational when I'm in a state of panic to say, I'm just going to figure it out. I'll do the next thing and the next thing. And I think sometimes people who are toxically overwhelmed and overworked can misuse the statement of just do the next right thing. And they're like, yes. So every task I have is the next right thing until I work 13 hours a day and I don't remember my kids' names and my dog barely gets enough food. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right. And so my body completely shuts down. And then I'm like, I don't know how this happened.
Yeah.
And then somebody on the outside goes, oh, I bet I could tell you.
Right.
Right. And
Did you ask?
I'm
Do you
glad that
have
you
to?
went there
Yeah.
first, Philip, because I would kind of theme that like maybe some unrealistic standards. I think for a lot of us who struggle with asking for help, and again, I'm just going to speak about myself here and be vulnerable, and hopefully it touches somebody else of where you're at. But like, I think there is this perception in the workplace for those of us that are achievement oriented people or grew up in achievement oriented homes, that we have to be really smart and impressive, and show that we're really capable all the time. Right. And how that manifests often is we end up setting these really unrealistic standards for ourselves and our work. And so we convince ourselves that no matter how long the task is, it's a reasonable amount of work. It's a reasonable amount of things to accomplish. Because if I was really actually smart and capable and the right person for the job, then I would be able to do all of this. And for a lot of us, there is another gear we can click into when we're working, right? Like, and this is kind of what you're describing, Philip, of like, well, if I just worked for 5 more hours, I could finish it. But then we don't realize how often we do that and that it kills your nervous system to push yourself like that on a regular basis. Like that should be a rare moment versus like, oh, well, like at least once a week I'm doing this. And I think if those of us who struggle with this were really honest with ourselves, it's because there's an insecurity there, right? And we're not willing to ask for help and we're not willing to say, I don't know that I can accomplish all of this. I don't know if this deadline is realistic. And sometimes what sucks about it is that, like, I set the freaking deadline, right? Because I also don't know how to measure what's a realistic standard for getting something done because I just think kind of it's subconscious. I'm not thinking, oh, what would an impressive person do here? But I'm thinking, okay, like, kind of what's the deadline that's going to make everybody happy? What's the deadline that everybody's going to go, oh yeah, that's amazing. Instead of what's the deadline that's actually realistic? Like if I'm truly the only person that can do this, which is often also not true, another lie we tell ourselves. But if I'm truly the only person in our company who can do this, is that a realistic timeline for getting that done or deadline for getting that done, considering the other work that's on my plate, and that I am a human being?
It makes me think George L. Orwell's book Animal Farm, which is maybe not always the safest to reference, not to
Like,
get
yeah, where are you going to go with
yeah,
this?
but one of the first books that really made me cry in middle school, required reading, was Animal Farm. And there's this character in it, the horse Boxer. He's this draft horse, just this great horse. He makes the farm amazing. Everyone loves Boxer, but his mantra is always, I will work harder. And not to blow the story, the farm falls into disarray. They're not aligned with, the animals that are taking over. Anyway, all that's not relevant to this story. The part that is that Boxer works and works and works to the point where he just dies. He literally works himself to death. And it's so sad because Boxer is truly the best character. But over the book, you start to see the other animals are watching him and they say, like, this isn't healthy. Something's wrong here. But he's the strongest. So if he doesn't keep working, we can't get it done. And I think a part of the thing that's just wrong with his mantra, I will work harder. It's not the farm can work harder, which I think is what we're getting at.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that was a great story. Sorry, I doubted your Animal Farm reference. But that was great. Yeah, and I think sometimes as leaders, we also have to recognize and acknowledge, number one, like we aren't the only person that could do this or could do this well, right? That there's probably other people on our team who could actually like take on that task or sit in that role, and it would be fine and it would be great. And you know, that sometimes we set those unrealistic standards again because we're trying to quell some insecurity on our side, or we are just not being honest with ourselves and taking on too much. And this is the stuff I'll tell you guys, like the stress that kills you. And like, I am someone who has dealt with panic attacks in their lives and dealing with managing anxiety. And this is the stuff that really does wear on your body. It's not just a mental fortitude thing. It's like you are a living human being, and your nervous system responds differently to these things than it does other stimuli. And it really can. It can overstress you. It can overwhelm you to the point where you can't process it anymore. So yeah, I think the unrealistic standard is something that we just have to be honest with ourselves about. And also, I would say the cure for that is grace for yourself and grace for others. Because I will say, when I hear leaders talk about this, or if I'm really honest of like what my internal talk sounds like sometimes, it's stuff I would never say to someone else. Like I would never look at somebody else on our team and be like, wow, like they did not accomplish this as much this month as we all thought they would. And so I wonder if they're even the right person. Did we make a mistake when we hired them? I would never think that about somebody on my team, right? Because honestly, this is the other truth, is we're thinking a lot more about it than anyone else is. And so like they probably haven't even noticed that maybe we got a little less done this month or this year even. And so just recognizing that and having some grace for ourselves that yes, if this was 100% within our control, we probably would have gotten it all done. But there's tons of stuff happening that's external that we can't control, that dictates how our businesses flow and operate and work. There's other people involved that like get in the way of us accomplishing our goals, quote unquote. That we just have to be realistic with ourselves, and that means sometimes giving ourselves grace to say like, I am being successful in my role. I am doing a good job and I'm doing my best. And that's all I can give, right? Like I need help. Sometimes if I've reached my limit, then I need to ask for help.
Yeah, I think you guys have been touching on it, but I think the hard truth for people who are overly busy or need help, I think the hard truth is that like it's usually your fault. Like,
Ouch.
and I think
Yeah.
that's really hard because it's people are thinking, no, I have to do all of this stuff. And I fall into this category, whether it's stuff at sometimes work, or a lot of times it's like all the other stuff outside of work too, that I'm like, well, no, I have this commitment or I've got to do this. And it's like, it goes back to what you were talking about, Stephanie, is it's like, it's just because it's my standards of how I want to live or the things that I want to accomplish or whatever. And so I've told myself I have to do this, and this, and then I'll feel really good. But then, yeah, totally same kind of cycle of where I burn myself out and I'm exhausted and I feel sick and I'm not taking care of myself, and it's all of those things. And we work with lots of people in that position, and as an outsider looking into those situations, usually it's like, well, do you have to do all of that stuff, or why are you even doing this thing? Like, that's nobody asked you to do that thing. And it's not, is it really benefiting the team the way that you think it is? Or do you feel like it's just like a, okay, if I do this, I'm going to prove my value for people. And I think there's a lot of, that we see too, where it's just like we're trying to, yeah, prove our value either to ourselves or to other people. And it's like, well, that's a deeper, to me, that's a deeper question that like you should probably sit with for a little bit of like, why am I putting so much pressure on myself to show value in this area of my life, whether that's at work or whether that's in your personal life too. And so, yeah, so that's just what I'd say is like, it's a hard truth to hear, but it's like, it's probably your fault. And also there are situations where we've seen people who do have a lot on their plate within their role, and it's happened usually happens over time. They've been put in a position, and then they became like the catch-all person. We talk about that a lot too. They become the catch-all person, and that's and it just is like a, hey, maybe there does need to be a conversation to say, actually, I don't think this is realistic for one person to do anymore. Maybe it was at one point, but it's not anymore. And so to the point of this whole conversation and talking about like how to ask for help is like, go to your boss and have that conversation with them and say, hey, like, here's how I'm functioning right now, and help me decipher, is this the role? Is this part, is this the issue with the role? Or do you see this as an issue with me? Are there things that are kind of on my plate that I need to just like not do because they're not necessary? Or are there things here that are like, really, this all has to be done and it's not reasonable for one person to do? So do we need to talk about how that needs to change on our team and within different roles and things like that? So I think it's okay to have that honest conversation to just figure out like what's really going on here and what actually needs to be done and what actually doesn't have to happen.
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah.
give an example to early on here at People Centric? It's such a different work culture that I wasn't used to. Bethany and I had a conversation, and I essentially asked that, like, I don't know if my stress levels are where they should be in these areas or not in others. Basically, I'm worried a lot about different things, right? Like, if you wake up at night, and it's not like anyone here was causing that was just internal of, I want to make sure I'm doing the thing and serving our clients and all this stuff. And I don't know if you remember this conversation or not, Bethany, but amazing advice. Basically, Bethany's question was, you're not the first person to experience that. And you said, I have. And kind of your own role you use for yourself is, am I more stressed about a situation than most of the rest of the team? And not that that's the only thing. If there's a fire in your office building, everyone's probably going to be really stressed about that, right? But if you find yourself really hyper fixated on something that seems uniquely stressful to you, to your point, that's a perfect time to then go to your team and go to your leader and just say, hey, is this right? Am I focusing on this the right way? Or am I missing something? Do I not know something? And just kind of helping guide that, which it's been very helpful for me. And I think a lot of times when we see people who get hung up on something, if our question is, well, hey, what if it could be a different way? They'll say, well, it has to be this way. And if your question, the follow-up, well, why? That's when they start to say, well, actually, I don't know. It's just always been this way, right? Or I think I'm the only one who can do this. And again, it just opens the door to opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you said that, Philip, because I think that touches on like sometimes we make up extra rules in our head about things, or like, when I've talked with some leaders about this recently, like hearing some of the rules they've made kind of boil down to like, well, I can't ask for help more than once about this thing. Right. And I don't think anyone would agree with that. Like when we say it out loud, like, can you ask for help more than once? Most people are like, sure. But in practical reality, a lot of times, like we'll be like, okay, well, could we ask to move that deadline or push it back by 2 days? And they're like, well, I already asked to move the deadline once. I was like, yeah, but maybe we still didn't move it to what was actually realistic and like what we could actually accomplish and do. Or a lot of times they're internal deadlines or standards that, spoiler, if you changed it, probably nobody from the outside would even know that you did. And again, like I know for the super achievers are on here, you're like, oh, so we're just gonna, move everything and everybody gets a trophy and never really hold the deadline. No, that's not what we're saying. But it is saying sometimes we have to acknowledge that we have put undue pressure on ourselves that did not need to be there, or we've set unrealistic standards for how quickly a task or something gets done. And I think we've prioritized the deadline over quality work or over mental balance on our team, that like if that is pushing us into a super uncomfortable and healthy space where the whole team's going to be super burnt out after we complete this project, well, what if we did it a different way?
Yeah, I think that's great, because we think about that stuff too on our team, and thinking about like what's a deadline, when should we have this outcome or this report or whatever we're promising to deliver a client at some point. And I think that we I think we kind of have a range that we talk about on these kinds of things. So I think it's good for your team to kind of have an understanding of like what's a reasonable range that we should have. But I think keep it as a range, because then you have a little bit of flexibility, because then it builds in time for what else is going on the calendar. Whether that's like, hey, I have this other really big thing happening at work around this time, or I'm going to need more from our team to be able to accomplish that, but they have this trip, or, I've already planned this thing far in advance of, this personal maybe vacation far in advance of when we said we would do this thing at work, or this for this client. And so I think it's okay to be able to work around those things and be reasonable and not be so whenever it comes to deadlines. And so creating a good range that you and your team can all kind of agree on certain deadlines, I think is really helpful. So that way, then when you do come back and say, hey, we talked about this time originally, we're still kind of within the range of what our bigger picture deadline looks like. Would everybody be okay if we kind of adjusted it here?
Yeah.
That's a good point. I was thinking, if you do that, I think one of the fears, that's a great solution to a fear of asking for help that we hear, which is, well, one, I'll look manic. I'll look crazy if I ask for help at this point, because it's, to the brink. Nobody knows anything. By the time I explain it, we're out of time. Whereas with that method where you have margin, you're like, hey, we actually have more clarity of a timeline, which is step one. And then second, I think it opens the door to what if, crazy idea, what if you ask for help before you really, really, really need it? What if you just ask for help when you really need it? That is great.
Well, I like that you said that, Philip, because I think that's the fear that people have, is if I've waited too long and I put the unrealistic deadline, and then now I am stressing the team out by saying, hey, it's the day before something needs to happen and I need help desperately. And so now you're stressing the whole team out, and nobody wants to do that, which I think is why people don't ask for help. But what all the things you said is like, ask for help before before you're in a desperate situation if you can, and then it's gonna be okay, and people are not gonna be as worried about it because you've created that margin. And so I think that's a very good point to kind of consider too.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think though it taps on maybe some delegation myths and things that hold people back from asking for help, because even hearing you guys say that, like, there's parts of me that, just as someone who struggles with this, that I resist that a little bit, because like, kind of, I think what my counter brain is saying is like, well, I sometimes don't know. And like, so to delegate correctly, I have to like pre-plan, and I have to plan through what I'm going to delegate and how I'm going to delegate it and who I'm going to delegate it to. And like, with what freaking time, right? Because I'm always running around like a chicken with my head cut off and going from task to task to task. So I kind of want to talk about this with our team, because I think there's two big myths to delegation that I hear a lot. And I'm going to point at this and even point at us, because it's not bad advice that we've been given. It's just sometimes we have to realize that we've used that to hold us back. So I think the two most common myths I hear is that, yes, it has to be pre-planned, that in order to delegate something, I had to have decided to have done it before right now. Right. When in reality is like, sometimes like I just need to decide to delegate something and do it right now because I realized in this moment I needed to delegate it. And that the other is that it has to be this like perfect delegation. And what I mean by that is what I hear from people a lot. And even we will give this advice sometimes, because it's not a bad advice, is okay, when you have to think about what of your role you could delegate, sit down and think about all the tasks. Think about what you're really good at, then think about your team and what they're really good at, and then match tasks to people. And then when you go and hand it to them, it's like this little beautiful present. And here's the thing, that's good advice if you actually have the time and mental bandwidth to do that. And I think this is why it holds people back from asking for help, because they are so overwhelmed, or you're too thick in it to take the time to pull back and actually like do that exercise in the moment. And so we just think, well, if it's not going to be like a gift to my team, or just Philip, to use you as the example of like, if I can't match a task to Philip's strengths or something he told me he wants to try more of or listen or learn, then me asking him for help or delegating this task to him is not a gift. It's a burden. And because I didn't pre-plan and tell Philip in advance that I was going to do this, now it's a super burden. And so, you know what? I'm just going to take it because I don't want to do that to Philip. I don't want to be that. And so I think those are huge myths about delegation, that we take good advice and kind of twist it a little bit to reinforce why we don't ask for help.
Great that you said that, because I think lots of times when you use beautiful words like delegation and engagement and empowerment and leadership, these are all things people are like, yeah, most people don't stand up and say those are terrible. But I think sometimes, yeah, the question is just, okay, what does that actually look like? And I think it comes from this belief or expectation there's a perfect time to delegate and there's a perfect time to ask for help. And I would say there's no such thing. It's always going to feel like an imperfect time to ask for help. And you're probably always going to feel really clunky when you start delegating things, especially at first. Your team will feel burdened. And I think as our team even would say, work is a great gift. And there's also just burdeny aspects of it too. And it's unrealistic to expect only one person to carry all of that. And I think sometimes if people are confused about what delegation looks like, we ask teams all the time, who is your great example of a delegator? Like, who in your entire career have you ever experienced someone who delegates well? And oftentimes people say yes to that. And then I'll ask, okay, do you work with them in your current organization? And a lot of the time people just say, no, this was someone I knew in college or in my high school job. So you wonder if with the same keen eyes they have now, if they really would consider that person a great delegator. But the question would be, who is that great delegator? Find them, and a task would just be ask them, like, how do they do that thing that you see? Just ask them. And if they're good at delegating, they're probably passionate enough to tell you how they do it well, because it's built into how they lead.
Yeah, Bethany, you kind of tapped on this earlier, but I think to piggyback on that, Philip, yeah, the advice that I would give to the person who is like, well, I'm too busy to even delegate or to take that time, or I can't none of these tasks are things that anybody on my team wants to do. So I'm just so lost in it that then a lot of times what we'll hear that leader say is like, well, I've already thought about it and I've already delegated everything that I could. And usually that's not 100% true. And so to tap on what Bethany said earlier, I think that's the moment where you go to a safe person on your team, of somebody, again, that you feel safe with, that you can be a little vulnerable with, and like show them what's on your plate and say, I'm kind of stuck. Like, this is way more than I can handle. I feel like I've already delegated some stuff, or I've already asked for help, but like it's still not happening, or it's still too much, or I'm seeing no way forward to meet this deadline. Can you sit with me and like, let's look at this for like the next like 20, 30 minutes and just go through it? And I genuinely want you to give me feedback and tell me where you see I could delegate something else to somebody on the team, or where you see we could make adjustments. I'll give a shout out to Bethany Taft, because she is this person in my life and is great at that. There will be moments where she'll ask me like, it seems like you're doing a lot. And I'm like, yeah, and I'm great. And it's wonderful. And then there'll be other days where she's like, it seems like you're doing a lot. And I'm like, yeah, and I don't know how to not. So could you look at this, and could you look at everything that's on my plate? Could you look at all the tasks and just tell me where you see that I could let go of something? And sometimes we need that outside input when our brains get stuck. But again, go to somebody on your team who you know is going to be kind to you about it, but just ask them for that advice.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things too, like, I think you just have to communicate what's going on in your brain. And I think a lot of times we just all carry this internally, and we're not very good about communicating. So when we talk about like the pre-planning, like, no, you can't pre-plan everything to say like, so you can perfectly delegate it. But if people have no idea what you're working on or what you're thinking about, or things like that, then it's a little bit hard for them to be able to jump in later when you do really need some help. And so the more that you can communicate about the things that you're thinking about, there's I had a conversation with somebody close to me, similarly, who was just cycling and feeling like really stressed out about stuff, and wasn't asking for help. And we had this conversation of like, if you don't tell people how you're feeling, they cannot help you. And it seems so, that sounds so simple, but it's like, I think so many of us do that. We just like cycle and we ruminate and we're stressed out, but we haven't told anybody like what we're thinking about or what we're worried about and why we're stressed. And if we really just sat down and sort of said, here's the things I'm thinking about, even maybe before you're stressed about it, but just, I know me and you, Stephanie, have talked about that a little bit too, of like when you are working on a lot of stuff and you have a lot going on, not even when you're stressed, of just like, hey, let the team know all the things that you're working on, or some of the plans that you have for certain clients or things like that, just so we're aware, because then later it's going to be easier for us to jump in when you are ready for us to help you with something. And so I think you might be even surprised at just communicating those things in advance before you need that help, I think is great, because you might not know what you need help with yet, but then it catches people up on just like what you're thinking about, where you're working. So
Totally. Yeah. Sometimes we have to ask for help, asking for help. So hopefully that sentence made sense. But like, I think one thing that has been helpful to me is just being open with our team that like, hey, like it's not supernatural for me to ask for help. This is something that like, again, like I've got some ego and some insecurity attached to it. And so I'm not always great at this. And so, yeah, Bethany, what you were just describing is like a good thing, like, and communication and workflow that you and I have developed working together for a couple of years now, of just saying like, Bethany knows that about me, and she knows that about me because I've been open about it. It wasn't that we had this like huge moment where Stephanie burnt out and hit the bottom, and all of a sudden then Bethany as the manager was like, oh, we've got to fix her. That's not what happened. What happened was I recognized at a certain point in my career that this is hard for me. And coming into People Centric, I think like one of my personal goals, again, just sharing here, was that like I wanted to be more open about that, because I recognize I'm never going to learn, I'm never going to get better at this if I first can't acknowledge that it's something that I need to grow in and I need to work on, and that I'm actually a better leader and I'm better at my job when I can ask for help. And so like talking about that early when I joined the team, now Bethany knows and she can ask me questions, and like I don't take offense to it at all when she's like, hey, I need you to slow down and like unpack some of this stuff so that way we can help you at some point. And she also knows too, like there are some moments where I'm like, yeah, I will do that, but also like I don't feel like I need help right now. And she's like, okay, great, but just like make sure we're in the loop so that way if you hit that point, we can help you. So sometimes you have to actually ask for help to in how to ask for help, and just being honest that that's hard for you, or even just like that it's hard for you to maintain boundaries sometimes. Cause I think a lot of the times when we're talking to leaders that struggle with this, they're also yes people. And we struggle with saying no to tasks, or somebody on the team comes to us and asks us for help for something. And then we start taking on other tasks or working on other issues over here that are kind of to our own detriment, because it pulls us away from what we should really be focused on. And then we're not accomplishing the things. And then again, that like insecurity, ego, imposter syndrome cycle just repeats itself. And so I think sometimes you also have to like tell somebody like, hey, I'm trying to do better at this. I'm trying to do better at not just taking on everything on my own. I'm trying to do better about actually looking at tasks and evaluating what is realistic for me. What am I actually uniquely gifted at? Or what could somebody else on the team do just as well or better than me? And I need your help in kind of like maintaining that boundary and holding that line and reinforcing that with the team. And again, that could be going to somebody on your team who feels like a safe person, or sometimes even going to your manager or boss and just saying, hey, this is something I'm working on, and I would really love to have your help with this. So
I think that's good. And also baby has joined the chat.
Hi, Audrey.
Say hi. She says hi.
Hi, Audrey. Yeah,
Squirrel.
babies are great at asking for help. So I'm glad that you showed up for this podcast, because babies can teach us. They just shout it out when they need it.
Yeah, they're not worried about my response. How quickly
He's
I'll
not
respond.
thinking about what you're thinking about. Yeah.
Right. That's right. Also, I forgot what I was going to say now, but this is a good, perfect
Yeah.
example. So,
Yes.
anyways.
Well, I hope this has been helpful for those of you who maybe are struggling to ask for help or this is hard for you. Oh, did you remember what you were going to say? Yeah.
Yes, I did remember. What I was going to say is like, if you're a leader too, yeah, and she needs some help too. But if you're a leader, do this because it models for your team too. Like, let them know that you need help and be willing to share with them when you are stressed out in a healthy way. Because then it makes it easier for your team to come to you when they need help. And so I think it's just know that as a leader too, like that's your responsibility. It's not a weakness as a leader to show that you need help.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm so glad that you added that and said that because yeah, like if you're feeling this on your team and you're like, wow, like my team is getting really overwhelmed and burnt out and you're wishing like, why aren't they just like asking me for help or I would do this or I want them to work more collaboratively together. It may be that you need to model some of this language and they need to hear you share when you need help, right? And the other maybe last thing I'll say on this is that a lot of times when we'll talk to leaders, we're like, well, has anybody on your team offered to help you? And if we're really honest, the answer to that is yes, that there's probably somebody who's been like, hey, if I can ever help you with something, let me know. And I think a lot of times we write that off as like, well, they were just being nice. They didn't really mean it. And I'm just going to push back on that because I will say, yeah, that's probably a little bit true, but not wholly true. That if somebody on your team has come to you, and especially if it was like, hey, I saw you're working on that thing. If you need help, let me know. They genuinely meant it. Right. So, no, that doesn't mean you're going to like dump the entire project on them by surprise. They don't want that. But that you could go to them and be like, hey, you mentioned this. Could we talk about this? I'd love to have your eyes on it, or I'd love to have you look at this. And that, like, we need to just, I think, get better as a culture of when somebody says, hey, if you need help, let me know, that like recognize they actually mean that. Like, I've just personally found if people don't want to help you, they don't offer to help you generally. Like, that's very rare, but somehow we've written it off that everybody who says that doesn't actually mean it. And so, again, maybe you don't believe me on 100% of that, but I would say if it's happening on your team and somebody on your team has offered to help you, it's probably because they were willing to help you. And so it's okay to go back to them even later, even if you said in the moment, no, I'm good, I'm great, I don't need anything, to go back later and be like, hey, you said you would be willing to help. Could we talk about this? Could I show you this and tell me what feels reasonable and realistic? And that leaders, like, I think we do absolutely need to model that for our teams, and take them up. Like when your team offers to help you, leader, like take them up on it. And you could be really pleasantly surprised with what your team could accomplish if kind of you got out of their way a little bit. So I think that's kind of back to the piece, Bethany, that you were saying at the top of like, sometimes we just have to admit that it is us and we're the one that's standing in the way of some of this. And there's probably some ego and insecurity that's attached to that. Or even like, well, I am the leader and I can't be asking my team to help with this all the time. Well, sure you can. Right. It's got to be healthy, right? And I think everybody does need to have a defined role on the team, that they have clarity of what's expected of them on a normal basis. But I think it's totally normal to ask for help, and do that. So, any final thoughts, Bethany and Audrey? Audrey, anything that you needed to add to this?
No, I think she's fine. We're good. This is good. No added
Good.
thoughts.
Good. Well, again, hope this was helpful to you. And if this is something that you're struggling with, or you feel like there was something that's unique to your situation that we didn't talk about, reach out to us. I know we say this at the end of pretty much every podcast, but we genuinely do mean it. This is one of those instances where if there is something that we can do to help you or help your team, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk through that with you and maybe hand over some helpful tools or perspective on some of those things, see how we can help your team or help you do better with this. I'll also say that for some of us, there may be some deeper digging to do, and therapy is amazing and great to help maybe figure out like, why do I struggle with this so much? So would highly recommend that as well. But if there's something that we can do to help, please let us know. All of the details to get a hold of us are in the outro. So with that, we hope you have a great rest of your day.